Good morning.
Good morning, good evening here.
Good morning, Dr. Sachs. You're just on time. I was a little nervous.
No, not
Good
at
morning,
all.
dear friends. Welcome to the Institute of European and American Studies at Academia Sinica. My name is Chien-Yi Lu. I'm a political scientist here at the Institute. I feel very privileged to be hosting such an important talk on such an important topic, the Ukraine war and its implications for the world. And it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Dr. Sachs is a world-renowned economist. He was twice named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders. Among the numerous awards he received was the recent Tang Prize Tangjiang for his work in sustainable development. He is currently the director of the Center for Sustainable Development of Earth Institute at Columbia University and president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He is also Sustainable Development Goals advocate under the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Dr. Sachs was special advisor to three United Nations Secretary Generals, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Ban Ki-moon, and Kofi Annan. He has also been economic advisor to governments in Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Among the long list of governments he advised were Russia and Ukraine. Dr. Sachs was one of the first few human beings on this planet to know that the Soviet Union was coming to an end, because on December 11, 1991, he was in Kremlin, inside President Yeltsin's office, when President Yeltsin made that decision. It's not just Dr. Sachs's experiences like these and his expertise that make his observation, analysis, and insights about the Ukraine war invaluable, but also his habit of being extremely frank, of speaking his mind, rather than being politically correct. That might also be the reason that many of you are drawn to this talk. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Sachs. Dr. Sachs, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. What a great honor it is.
Please
Oops.
unmute. You have not unmuted.
No, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Okay. First, let me say what a pleasure and honor it is to be together with you, and also to thank the people of Taiwan for the absolutely wonderful reception and visit that my wife and I celebrated just 2 weeks ago. So we had a fantastic time with the Tang Prize Week and met some of you and really cherished the visit and look forward to the next time to be together. And I thank you for the chance to share some thoughts with you about Ukraine, and maybe I will be on the briefer side so that we can have some discussion also. I'm following events closely in Ukraine, and I hope elsewhere in the world. It's a very troubling time. I'm very unhappy about U.S. foreign policy, as I said many times during the week of my visit, because I feel that it is dangerous and provocative and leading us in a very dangerous way. This war in Ukraine is a case in point. It is a war that is essentially a war between the United States and Russia. It's in which Ukraine is the battleground. It's a war of wills between two superpowers, where the United States wants to incorporate Ukraine fully into the U.S.-led military and economic system, especially NATO, but also other aspects of the US-led system, and in which Russia is asserting that for reasons of fundamental national security as well as national interest, it will not let Ukraine be drawn into the U.S. military alliance. This is at the core of this war. And so far, both sides are playing a game of escalation and chicken, in which each side escalates, daring the other side to escalate, and in which Ukraine suffers more and more grievous disasters as a result of this mutual escalation. But the Ukrainian government is a party to this war also, because it is a Russophobic government that signed on to the idea of defeating Russia with the U.S. backing. This is an impossible goal, literally absolutely impossible, but it is the stated objective and real objective of the Ukrainian government. And so it is a objective that is leading Ukraine to destruction as we speak. The roots of this conflict, of course, go back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the 15 states of the Soviet Union became independent. And Ukraine was early in declaring its independence in 1990. Even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was a precipitator of the dissolution. But in Ukraine's declaration of independence, and it's in an initial constitution, Ukraine said that it would be a permanently neutral state. And this is very important. Ukraine is the borderland between West and East in Europe. It's a borderland culturally and a borderland politically. It's the dividing line between the Catholic and Protestant West and the Orthodox East. It is a dividing line between the Polish-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking West and the Russian-speaking East. And of course, the word Ukraine itself in Russian means borderland, and it was always viewed by Russia as a protective zone against Western invasions which came repeatedly to Russia, including from Poland in the 16th and 17th centuries, and from Napoleon and from Hitler, that Ukraine was the Western boundary and in effect also a safety zone to some extent for the heartland of Russia. Well, in 1991, the Soviet Union ended. Ukraine became independent and a neutral country that was divided between ethnicities, Ukrainian in the West, Russian in the East. Quite fragile. I was an advisor to the first government of independent Ukraine, and the situation was quite miserable, and the country barely functioned as an independent country. It had been an administrative region of the Soviet Union for 75 years, and for hundreds of years before that, it had been an administrative region of the Russian Empire. So it had never been an independent state for an operational period of time, and it showed. So it was a very difficult start. But it survived the initial few years. And at the beginning of the 1990s, of course, Russia was very vulnerable in financial crisis. And my job as an advisor to President Yeltsin was to try to help to raise Western finance to help Russia to stabilize in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Soviet Union. I failed completely in that because the United States was implacably opposed to any kind of financial support for Russia in stabilization. And indeed, Russia did not stabilize for almost a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that built up a lot of resentment, of course, but it was even more indicative of the US political attitude, which is that the United States had won the Cold War, and there was no reason to support even the successor state of the Soviet Union that was aiming to become a normal, peaceful, cooperative state in the system. Better to let it be weak, let it fail, and for the United States to enjoy its unipolar power that came with the demise of its foe. And this was the US attitude I came to discover, and I really disliked it from the beginning because it's an attitude of arrogance and ignorance, and it came back to haunt the United States in this arrogance. But one of the first actions of the US in this new unipolar environment was the expansion of NATO. And this, of course, came despite the explicit promises that had been made by the US government and the German government to President Gorbachev in 1990 that with the end of the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage. And so it would be safe for Germany to unify because NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, to use the phrase that James Baker used in 1990 with Gorbachev. And Gorbachev said, yes, that is essential, that NATO not expand. Gorbachev was very trusting. He was a person of peace. The United States is very duplicitous. And as soon as they had the opportunity, they broke the promises and indeed declared, we never made any promises at all. This is the US way. So by 1992, the United States started to plan the expansion of NATO. And this was controversial within the US government because there were parts of the US government that were opposed to breaking the promise that had been made. And most notably in the Clinton administration, the Secretary of Defense, William Perry, was opposed to NATO enlargement and even considered resigning in 1995 over this push for NATO enlargement. But President Clinton decided to expand NATO. I think this was basically a decision of the US security apparatus, but it was combined with a lot of lobbying in the United States by the military companies, especially Raytheon, which led the lobbying effort, and also by the Polish American community, the Czech American community, the Hungarian American community, which pressed for NATO enlargement. Now, as you know, NATO enlarged in 2 big waves. First, in the end of the 1990s to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And Russia was quite unhappy about this, but not vociferously unhappy because those are countries in Central Europe. They are not on the Russian border, and they are not the most sensitive spots for Russia. But in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski published the plan for NATO enlargement in Foreign Affairs magazine when he laid out a timeline in which the first wave would be Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and the second wave would be the Baltic states and the littoral states of the Black Sea, Bulgaria and Romania, And the third wave would be Ukraine and Georgia. And according to Brzezinski, that third wave would come in 2005 to 2010. And the U.S. followed that timeline. In 2004, NATO expanded by 7 more countries, the 3 Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And in 2008, famously, the Bush administration insisted at the Bucharest NATO summit that Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members. And Russia was very, very strongly saying, don't do that, saying this is our absolute red line. Putin made an important speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 when he said that this NATO enlargement needed to stop. And in 2008, he told George Bush in Bucharest that if U.S. goes ahead, it would mean war. And of course, the United States went ahead because the defining feature of U.S. foreign policy is that it cannot hear any other country's red line. To do so is defeatist, appeasement. And so the U.S. doesn't listen anymore to anybody. And that remains true until today, I'm afraid. So in 2010, President Viktor Yanukovych won the election and called for neutrality of Ukraine. But in 2013, when he resisted signing an association roadmap with the European Union, saying that it had to be delayed because Russia was objecting to parts of it, a protest broke out that was heavily stoked by the United States. So the U.S. poured in a tremendous amount of money and organizational effort and media support to stoke the protests in the Maidan demonstrations. And I know some of that firsthand because one of the leading NGOs explained to me how much American money was flowing into supporting the demonstrations. In January 2014, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, spoke with the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, on the phone, and the phone call was intercepted by the Russians and posted online, and it showed the two of them discussing who would be the post-Yanukovych government in Kiev. They were plotting regime change, basically, is the only way to put it. And their call was around January 27th, and the Yanukovych government fell on the 22nd of February, so about 3.5 weeks later. But the U.S. was planning for the overthrow of Yanukovych, which in the end came violently with the right-wing paramilitaries led by nationalist, anti-Russian Ukrainian paramilitary forces with the U.S. support. And Yanukovych fled, and the United States recognized the new government the first day, and Russia basically saw that this was the start of war. And within a few weeks, Russia had retaken Crimea in response, because Russia's naval base is in Sevastopol, of course, as it has been since the year 1783. So this goes back 240 years now as the site of Russia's naval base, and Russia was in no mood to let the United States take over Russia's naval base in the Black Sea. So the war broke out in February 2014, and the United States began to pour in armaments. And part of the Ukraine military, the Russian-speaking Eastern forces, mutinied and declared autonomy of the Russian eastern regions. And so a civil war broke out within Ukraine that really was a civil war. Putin was not the author of those breakaway forces. That was an internal civil war that began. And the United States supported the Western Ukraine government now in power in Kiev. And though two agreements were negotiated, the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, to reestablish peace internally in Ukraine based on autonomy of the eastern regions, Lugansk and Donetsk. The Ukrainian government, with the strong support of the United States, rejected implementation of those agreements. And that's also quite interesting because the Minsk II agreement was unanimously backed by the UN Security Council, but this had absolutely no effect on US foreign policy, which again truly does not care at all about a UN Security Council vote. And the US urged Ukraine not to implement the agreement, which was very much in line with the Ukrainian government's view. At the same time, France and Germany were guarantors of the Minsk II agreement, and they also provided no impetus or advocacy for the implementation of the agreements. And the combination of the military coup, the arming of Ukraine by the United States, and the failure of the Minsk II agreements, of course, poisoned the diplomacy, so that the situation between the United States and Russia was very fraught by the end of the 2010s. But surprisingly to me, and alarmingly to me, everything became far worse when President Biden came to office, because Biden came in even more unilateralist and neoconservative than Trump. And this was a big surprise to me. Unilateralist, I mean in the sense of the United States demanding its way, whether in Asia or in Europe, of course, appealing to allies to support the US as the leader and to get in line with the US. So unlike Trump, Biden appeals to allies for an alliance, but Biden was even more aggressive against China and against Russia than Trump. And this was a big surprise to me politically, actually. And I don't quite understand it because politically I've been a Democratic Party voter for decades. But now I find that the point of view that I have in foreign policy, which was an anti-war point of view and used to be a dominant or at least a major part of Democratic Party politics, even though the party was always divided between hawks and doves, now doesn't exist. The party is almost entirely hawkish in orientation. So when Biden came in, he took a very aggressive position that NATO will enlarge, that the US will increase its funding for armaments in Ukraine, and that NATO enlargement is none of Russia's business. And this is quite important to understand. It's formal NATO policy and formal American policy that the issue of NATO enlargement involves only the NATO countries and the candidate country, but no other country has any say in the matter of enlargement, and specifically that Russia has no say in the question of NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. That is entirely within NATO and between NATO and Ukraine and Georgia. But when Russia objects, there is no basis for negotiation with Russia over those issues because NATO has no responsibility to any other country about where it is based and how it enlarges. And so 2021 was a very difficult period. Of course, it was also the COVID period, but it was a period of rising tensions between the United States and China and the United States and Russia. And at the end of 2021, on December 17, Russia put forward a draft proposal for U.S.-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO enlargement and a limitation on the placement of missiles of the United States in areas close to the Russian border. The United States flatly rejected any negotiation over these issues and replied formally to Russia in January 2022 that it would not negotiate on the question of NATO. On February 21st, 2022, the Russian Security Council met, and in the minutes that are online, President Putin asks Minister Lavrov for a statement of the state of negotiations or diplomacy over Russia's security concerns, and Lavrov declares that the negotiations have failed because the Americans have replied that there are no grounds for negotiation over these issues. And President Putin gave an address to the Russian people explaining that we have not been heard, we are left with no alternative, and Russia's invasion took place on February 24th, 2022. It was just 1 week later that Zelensky declared publicly that Ukraine would consider neutrality as a potential way to stop the war. And quite interestingly, in early March 2022, negotiations began between Russia and Ukraine just about 2 weeks after the start of the special military operation. And these negotiations were hosted by Turkey. And they made good progress for a couple of weeks. And in fact, the two sides were coming close to an agreement based on Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. But the United States intervened and explained to Ukraine that it should fight instead of conceding neutrality, and that the U.S. would increase the arms shipments to Ukraine, including major weapon systems like the HIMARS, and that Ukraine would defeat Russia through a combination of the NATO weaponry and the Western sanctions. And so Ukraine told Turkey that it was suspending negotiations, and it declared publicly that there would be no negotiations until Ukraine had recaptured all of the territory taken by Russia, including Crimea. Now, the most basic point is Ukraine cannot achieve this militarily under any circumstances, in my opinion, because if it did achieve a military breakthrough against Russia, as unlikely as that is, Russia would escalate to the point of nuclear weapons. And this is the fundamental flaw in the military approach from the beginning. Russia views the conflict as an existential conflict. The United States views it as a nice conflict because First, it doesn't involve U.S. Troops at all. Second, it weakens Russia. So the U.S. is quite comfortable with the conflict. As long as the Ukrainians want to fight, the U.S. will be happy to arm them. But for Russia, this is existential. And so the Ukrainian war aims are, in my opinion, tragic, completely unachievable, and doomed, therefore, to fail. But the United States is under no pressure to resolve that paradox or that conflict between stated goals and reality, because it's not American soldiers on the ground. It's only American weapon systems, and the U.S. is more than happy to provide them. And by U.S., I mean the security apparatus and the Congress. The American people are not very happy, but no one is asking them their opinion about this. So to just draw this to a conclusion, we are now a year and a half after the launch of the Russian invasion. We are 9 years after the start of the war, and there are still basically there is still a fundamental impasse in that the United States position is that NATO will enlarge to Ukraine, and Russia's position is it will never enlarge to Ukraine. And we have an ongoing war of attrition that every day claims around 1,000 Ukrainian deaths and massive destruction of Ukraine, and a political impasse because the U.S. takes the view that any concession on these issues would make the U.S. look weak compared to China, would lead to the administration being attacked by the hawks inside the U.S. And so the U.S. position is continue to escalate and do not make any concessions on NATO issues. Russia's view is that Russia will fight a war of attrition and that it has sufficient friends in China, India, Brazil, Africa, that it is not isolated and that it can carry on this war until Ukraine runs out of young men. And so Russia's feeling is that this is a war that could go on for a long time, and if necessary, would escalate. So day by day, we have this continuing disastrous war of attrition, and no public voices in the United States, in the political circles, calling for any alternative at all. Well, that's not quite true. Trump is saying, I'll end the war in one day. And it could be true because Trump wouldn't care about NATO enlargement. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who will be a real annoyance to Biden next year during the primary season, says this is an unnecessary war and we should negotiate. But in the Congress and in the administration, all voices publicly are, we will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes to achieve Ukraine's objectives. The Ukrainians, at least by that I mean the current political leadership, is of course profoundly dug in. It is said that if Zelensky said that he wanted to negotiate, he'd probably be killed, and that is quite possible, or taken out. So the Ukrainians are not any source of negotiating breakthrough at all. And so this is the impasse. It's profoundly dangerous and illogical uh, and destructive. And all of the logic says that we should end this through a absolutely basic and sensible agreement, in my view, which is the United States should say we never should have pushed for NATO enlargement. We should have let Ukraine be neutral and safer as a result. And if Russia will go home, we will stop arming Ukraine, and Ukraine will become neutral and receive its guarantees in other ways through a public treaty and the UN Security Council, and monitored withdrawals of troops on all sides and weaponry on all sides. And that's how it should end. But it could be a long time before that happens because of the political dynamics that I've described. So let me stop there. That's my view of the situation. Of course, you can see I'm rather profoundly unhappy with U.S. foreign policy, which I think knows how to make more trouble than it solves. It's very provocative. It's very dangerous. It does not estimate risks well, and it catches other countries in a lot of trouble because it puts them in the middle of great power confrontations. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. Usually when you talk, I can sense some upbeat spirits, but more recently, I think even you are sounding more and more pessimistic. So it's really worrisome. So now I will open up the floor. I think there must be tons of questions from the audience. Please make your question brief because so that other people can also ask question. You can use that. There's a hand sign. You can use that sign to raise your hand. Right now, I don't see any hands raising up right now. So, okay, Laura, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
I hear you, Laura. Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is Laura. I'm a PhD student here in Taiwan, third year. Actually, I'm from Russia. Originally, accidentally, I just born in Russia, then we just living in Tajikistan for a long time. And unfortunately, after the Soviet Union just ended, we move again to Russia because of the war in Tajikistan. And this is my second war in country. Yeah, and I think, what do you think about the government? I mean, if the government will change, uh, is it helps to stop this war? I mean, a new person, can he or she change the situation? Thank you.
And a new person in the U.S. or in Russia, do you mean? Or in
No,
Ukraine?
in Russia, in Russia,
In Russia. Oh,
yeah.
in Russia, I would say the weight of opinion is at least as much that Putin is being too soft and not aggressive enough as the other way. So, in general, I think it is probably true, though we're guessing in this circumstance, but I think it is probably true that President Putin is rather popular at a public level in Russia, not among many intellectuals I know, but among the general population. And also, I know by following Russian blogs and Russian commentary that there is a feeling that he's too soft, that he has let this go on too long, that he should escalate, attack Kiev, destroy the government in Kiev, and so forth. So I think that the idea that some kind of change of government in Russia will end the war is, of course, possible, but not likely. And the U.S. idea that there would be a regime change because of public pressure against Putin is even more unlikely. Of course, the U.S. would like to find a way to make regime change. That's how it operates its foreign policy. But I don't think that this is either prudent or likely to come to any solution because, in general, the elite support for this war is rather strong among the political class, and Putin could easily be followed, if he is followed by someone else, by someone that's far more hardline than he is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, actually it sounds really pessimistic. I said, I should say, because I don't see any like ways to stop it in a few next maybe month or even years. And I think it's really it's real tragedy to the people, even they're not in the country like me. I think most of the people really like suffer enough, especially in Ukraine, or people who have a family there. Yeah, thank you so much for your speech. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just say again, from a logical point of view as well as a moral point of view, this war could be stopped very quickly. It would be stopped on the basis of recognizing the interests of all of the parties. What Russia should get out of this is that NATO would not expand. What NATO should get out of this is that Russia goes home. And this is a basic deal that is achievable, but for these deeply set political reasons, the U.S. will not offer it because the U.S. views any statement about NATO not enlarging as soft. But my view is that that does not protect Ukraine. It actually condemns Ukraine to ongoing violence. Of course, it's very important to understand that from the U.S. point of view, the U.S. politicians do not care about the destruction of Ukraine. This is a rather cynical statement, but it's a serious one. What they care about is that Putin does not win. They don't care about Ukraine losing. People and territory and culture and peace, they don't care. What they want to do is to inflict a loss on Russia. And if the Ukrainians will continue to fight, they will continue to arm them. And this is quite tragic. Of course, in truth, the Ukrainians should be the one to say, we want the war to stop now. We want these two big powers to separate and leave us alone. But the Ukrainians don't know how to say that. They believe the US is their savior, and they don't know how to say it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this is how real politics works, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Wu Chongli, did you raise your hand?
Can you hear me, Professor Sachs?
Yes, very well.
Oh, okay. It is widely believed that somebody say that Ukraine today and Taiwan tomorrow. I'm not sure. Have you heard this before? So if we can learn a lesson from the Russia and Ukraine's war, what can we do, or what kinds of things we can do, especially when we apply. If we can learn a lesson and then apply to the Taiwan and China's relationship. What kinds of things we should do prepare to prevent that kinds of things might happen. I mean, especially to Taiwan. Yeah, that's my major question. Thank you.
Yes, of course. I don't want to be presumptuous, in the circumstances that I do not fully understand. But I would say, with all due respect, that the major lesson is that arming Taiwan is not a solution to political issues. Fundamentally, there are political issues. The US model fundamentally is arm Taiwan to the teeth to protect Taiwan. But of course, my view is arming Taiwan to the teeth risks destruction more than anything else. And this, I think, is, for me, the main lesson. The main issues are, in my opinion, political and negotiable. And again, you know, it's a very complicated history and complicated subject. But what I would try is one country, two systems, 1992 consensus that basically says, leave us alone and we're not going anywhere. And we don't need to be armed, and we are not aiming to be in the US camp. We are aiming for peace across the straits and want to reduce tensions and maximize interactions rather than any other approach. This is my own guess and belief. What I see repeatedly in my 68 years of life is the US arming countries that end up getting destroyed by that very process. And this is the tragedy. It's Henry Kissinger's old adage, famous adage, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And it's the paradox that the way the US understands things is through armaments and power, and it does not understand diplomacy anymore. This is, to me, a very real truth. American diplomacy ended 30 years ago. That's a strange statement, but I mean it in truth. America does not know how to negotiate with its adversaries because America's model is unilateral surrender of the other side. We are America. You do what we say. If you block us, it will be dangerous for you. And of course, this is an extraordinarily naive and destructive idea. And the US has implemented it all over well, not all over the world, but it's implemented it in Afghanistan, disaster, Iraq, disaster, Syria, disaster, Libya, disaster, Ukraine, disaster. And the same people that advocated for this unilateralist, military-led policy in all of those countries are in charge today. So, in my opinion, the most disastrous person in our government today is Victoria Nuland, who is now the Deputy Secretary of State. She has been in every position that has been a position of destruction for 20 years. She was Cheney's deputy in the launch of the Iraq War. She was the U.S. ambassador to NATO in 2008 with the enlargement of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. She was Hillary Clinton's assistant during the U.S. covert operation to overthrow the Syrian government. She was the U.S. advisor during the NATO operation to overthrow Libya's government, Muammar Gaddafi. And she was the point person in the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014. And for all of these things, she kept getting promoted. Now, last month, she got promoted again from Undersecretary of State to acting Deputy Secretary of State. So that's the sad fact of American foreign policy. The more disasters, the more promotion you get. So just be very careful. In truth and in all seriousness, the way to peace, I believe, is for the people across the straits to speak with each other, because it's basically people who know each other well and are know what this is about, not for an outside force to come in and say with armaments we're going to tip the balance. But of course, this is very much not the standard view of things, which believe that military power is the key to safety.
Highly appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask question?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, Jolene from Academia Sinica. And well, thank you, Professor Sachs, for your very insight analysis about what happened. But from as a political scientist, I think it's oversimplified. Just blame one actor, the United States. Since in the early 19th, after collapse of Soviet Union, you served as advisor to Yeltsin.
Yes.
Let's first ask, the personality, the leadership, doesn't make any difference. What is the Yeltsin be the leader? You think he would have done the same thing in 2014 and 2022? That's the factor of individual leadership. And follow up, sorry, I asked a little bit more question, is 2014 Crimea annexation. In a way, it was quite easy, less than a month. You know, Russia won the battle and also laid out a referendum, and they annexed Crimea. Had it been different way, had Putin met more difficulties, it was not so easy. You think it will give him a second thought about invading Ukraine in 2022? And then another thing, the third factor is the public opinion. In 2008, I thought 20% of Ukraine people are interested in joining NATO. But today, 80% of Ukraine people are interested in joining NATO because they are threatened. Part of their territory was annexed. And can you blame Finland and Sweden? They were also interested in joining NATO. You think Russia could have done the same thing to them? Because Russia say no. If you do otherwise, they will be attacked. My three questions.
Great, thank you very much. Let me say that in the late 1980s and early 1990s, both President Gorbachev and President Yeltsin quite extraordinarily wanted absolutely peaceful, normal relations with the United States. And the United States did not take yes for an answer. This is the biggest tragedy of all. I know this is not the question you're asking, but I think it's very important. President Gorbachev brilliantly said, I want all conflict between the Soviet Union and the West to end. I will unilaterally disband the Warsaw Pact. And this was an act of great genius and statesmanship. Of course, he's hated within Russia because of this now, because the West took advantage, absolutely cheated on this. Rather than saying, now we can make a constructive relationship, the West said, now we won and you lost, and now we will do what we want. And this body language reflected everywhere by the United States, in NATO enlargement, in bombing Serbia in 1999, in invading Afghanistan in 2001, in invading Iraq in 2003, in abandoning the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, in attempting to overthrow Assad in 2011, and so forth. This is what poisoned the relationship with Russia. I know Russia quite well. It's not an easy place by any means, but it was absolutely seeking a normal relationship with Europe and with the United States. And the United States didn't believe it or didn't care. And so the idea was, we now can run the show and you have no say. And so many things were done which were unilateral and against Russia's interests that it finally boiled over. So I believe that when it comes to the personalities, Yeltsin's big problem was that he was drunk a lot of the time. So I don't know what kind of leader he would be. He wasn't sober enough in the later years, and that's a real tragedy. Gorbachev was a wonderful person. He was very trusting, and maybe he would have been taken advantage of. Putin is a very hard man and reacted strongly, but not quickly, because I know many European leaders that dealt with Putin in the early 2000s who found him completely cooperative and congenial. And this is very interesting to understand. You know, some of my best friend leaders in Europe were dealing normally with Putin in the early years, but Putin was objecting to the US unilateralism repeatedly. And it started with Serbia with the bombing in 1999. 47 straight days of NATO bombing of Belgrade to break up Serbia. And this was a terrible policy of the US, by the way, terrible. It destroyed Serbia, and they broke away Kosovo, and then they claim, inviolate borders, but the United States violently broke the border of Serbia. Then came the Afghan war, then came 9/11, and Putin said, he wanted to help the United States, which he surely did, by the way, because Russia also did not want the jihadist militants attacking Russia. But the United States the next year abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally. And this was really a heavy blow for Russia, because the US started to put in Aegis missiles already in Romania and Poland. The plans and the missile emplacement started in the mid-2000s, and then in 2010 to 2018, putting in these missiles close to the Russian bases. And so that was the next abuse. The Iraq War was a massive abuse. And then Syria needs to be understood, because it's not properly understood. The Syrian war was a US regime change operation that went badly, because the idea was that the CIA and Saudi Arabia would overthrow Assad. But Assad showed that he had staying power. And then Russia intervened 4 years later, or 3 years later. And we in the West blame Russian intervention in Syria without understanding that it was the US that destabilized Syria in the first place in 2011. I know that story on the inside from the United Nations, because the UN tried to negotiate a peace in 2012, but the United States blocked the peace. It demanded that Assad must go before there could be any peace. So I don't think that this is really about Putin per se, although he is a much tougher person, no doubt. He's a KGB man. He understands and rejects the hard U.S. line, but he was very cooperative for many, many years when he came to power. This is not that Russia took the first steps. The United States took many, many dangerous and provocative steps along the way, and I think that this is the basic point is the U.S. can't listen to other countries right now. It can't hear them. And in 2008, very interestingly, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who's now our CIA director, William Burns, wrote a very interesting memo that everybody should read because you can find it online. It was leaked by WikiLeaks. And the title of it is Niet means Niet. This is Russia's red line. Do not expand NATO to Ukraine. The whole political class is against it, said Burns. It will be destabilizing. Russia doesn't want to have to intervene in Ukraine, but this would lead to instability inside Ukraine. It would be very dangerous. But the U.S. cannot hear those things right now. This is a big problem. So if there really are red lines in Beijing, the U.S. will never hear them, by the way. They just can't hear them. This is the biggest problem. It's the biggest danger. The whole approach of U.S. diplomacy is nobody can tell us what the red lines are.
Professor Shao Yunzhong. Yunzhong, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chien-Yi, and thank you, Professor Sachs. Actually, my question is the same as one of Zhao Cho's, Professor Zhao Cho's question, but it seems that you forgot to answer that one. That
yeah,
is
please
about
go back.
The public opinion of the Ukrainian people. That one. Because I think I have the same general impression as Professor Zhao Lin, that the majority of the Ukrainian people seems right now that preferring to join the Western camp. And in your opinion, would you say that that's because they are misled by the US propaganda, or that it's a genuine but a very unfortunate opinion that they would want to join the Western camp? Yeah, that is my first question.
So I think, first of all, we need to distinguish. First of all, I have no idea what the actual public opinion is right now, but let's just make the following points. In Crimea and the Donbas, you have basically large Russian majority populations. And what is really the public opinion there? I doubt that it is a pro-Ukraine position. I really doubt it. So if there was a vote in Crimea, I think it would go overwhelmingly towards Russia again, because it's basically a Russian place and a Russian population. In Kherson and Zaporizhia, which are two of the other four of the four places, I think it would probably be pro-Ukrainian, not pro-Russian, in terms of the specific question, which side do you want to join? If it is the question magically, do you want to join NATO? I have no idea exactly, but it's not a meaningful question right now, because Russia's never going to allow Ukraine to join NATO, period. That's not for a vote from Russia's point of view. And I can tell you, even if Mexico votes to join a military alliance with the PRC, it's not going to happen. Whether it's right or not right, it's not going to happen, because the United States would invade Mexico before that happened, or overthrow the government, period. And so Ukrainian public opinion, up until the overthrow of Yanukovych, was against joining NATO. This is important to understand. Then a coup came. Then violence broke out. Then what public opinion is really expressing, I don't know, but even if it shifted suddenly because of the coup and other things and the Russian attack, it doesn't change two underlying factors. When there was peace, the Ukrainian people just wanted quiet, and we don't want to join NATO. Maybe they do want to join NATO right now because there's a war. But the war was provoked over this very question. And Russia will not stand for it. That's a fact. One can say that's just or unjust. I happen to believe it's just, by the way, in one sense, not the war, but I believe Russia should have a veto over NATO enlargement to Ukraine. As a moral point of view, I don't believe the argument that every country gets to join its own military alliance because of what economists call externalities. Who you are allied with affects your neighbor as well. So I do believe in collective security, not in individual country security. And therefore, I believe that any issue about NATO enlargement to Russia's border should involve Russia. Should, at least in a period of peace, because otherwise it's likely to provoke a war, which it did. So I guess that I'm trying to answer as best I can. I don't know. The public opinion will differ in different places and different perceptions of in the middle of a war, but I believe the right approach for Ukraine, the advice I would give to Ukraine overwhelmingly is be neutral and demand that the two superpowers get out of your country rather than appeal for NATO, which is almost a death wish because it cannot actually be achieved. And I lived during the past year in Vienna, and Austria is a very important case. It's the one place in Central Europe that had Soviet troops occupying the country that went home before 1989. And why did they go home? They went home because in 1955, the Austrian state declared permanent neutrality. And on that basis, the Soviet troops went home. And what the Soviet Union was doing was signaling to the United States, do the same for Germany, and we can go home too. And the United States said, no, Germany will remain in NATO. And so the Soviet Union remained occupying Eastern Europe until 1989. Whereas I believe the Cold War could have ended in the 1950s on the basis of German neutrality. And that view, as strange as it sounds, is exactly George Kennan's view. George Kennan said in the 1950s, go for German neutrality and we can end this division of Europe. But he, by that time, was out of the State Department and the US government wasn't listening to him.
Christine May. Christine?
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Sachs. I really appreciate your point of view in terms of the beginning of the war, the root cause of this conflict. And I actually, my understanding is that Russia actually asked to join NATO at one point in the past, and that of course it was rejected. And the very fact NATO is there is now in existence, I don't even understand the purpose of it. And if United States really want to have the real security in Europe, then Russia should work with the European countries. But obviously, that is not the true intent of the United States. From what we understand, the war, the Ukraine war, has the biggest beneficiary or short-term beneficiary are the military-industrial complex, those companies that are making tons of money. And for the purpose of what? For making money, sell weapons. And they have gone to the cluster munition. All these things are forbidden by the international communities. And so it's unfortunately, this whole war has been painted in a way that's totally, in terms of Western media, is totally one-sided and it's totally for the United States benefit. And we know when this happened, the rest of the world suffers. And as you have excellently outlined in the past, all these different wars. So my question is, how do in many other parts of the world, people had come to realization this is not just a simple Russian invasion Ukraine, but rather something that is a confrontation between U.S. and Russia. And U.S. obviously trying to use this opportunity to drag Russia down. And after they finish that, they will go to China. And that's why they are expanding NATO. So my question for you is, how do we, you are one of the few voices in the United States that would speak out the truth, but the rest of the country, most people don't even understand that. Especially that's dangerous for us is the big press like Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN. They told the government's point of view. So the United States citizens are being suffered, being cheated out of this whole truth, learning the truth. And with recent Maui, the fire, we know that how badly the island's been destroyed. And but the Biden administration want to send money to Ukraine instead of keep the money here. So my questions for you is, how do we change the opinion of the public opinion within the U.S.? Because obviously this is not done for the benefit of the United States in the long run, because we see as a result of the war, the de-dollarization, what was the fundamental pillar of U.S. hegemony, is starting all over the world. And we all only hear from the, from our point of view, is from West, the reporting, but the rest of the world doesn't look at that way. So I would like to see how you, with your prestige and position, or how do we change this? Because Congress is hopeless. They don't see anything. This Congress is the worst institution in the United States, I think, for understanding the truth. And but they have a lot of influence. So do you have any ideas what to do to change the narratives of this whole thing? Because it's going to drag the United States down, because the war will hurt Russia, but it already hurt Europe, and it's going to hurt the United States down, and United States. So as a U.S. citizen, I was wondering, how do we do to change the narrative?
You make very many important points, and one is about Congress. There is no debate in the U.S. Congress about this, because the military industrial companies by design have production in every congressional district in the country. And they are important lobbies for the campaign contributions of the incumbents. And I know that this is an important aspect for each congressman. I have to support the military industry. So, but the respect of the American people for the Congress is only about 10% of the American people right now approve of the performance of the U.S. Congress, because it's such a corrupted institution. It's a very serious problem. Just to say quickly on some of the points you raised, the right security arrangements for Europe should have been the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was aimed at a European security arrangement, not a North Atlantic security arrangement. It is said, and I think there's some merit to it, that one of the reasons that the United States actually pressed for NATO also was to stop a rapprochement between Russia and Germany, that this would be too powerful and the United States would actually lose its influence in Europe because Russia and Germany would cooperate. And they are a natural cooperating unit because of Russian energy and German industry. And this is partly what the United States aimed to break. And they literally broke it by destroying the Nord Stream pipeline, but they also broke it in this way to tell the Germans, don't even consider being integrated with Russia. You are part of our camp, not their camp. And the German mainstream politicians have gone along with this, but ironically, the German right wing is rising significantly in public support because the recession in Germany is very significant right now. This is hitting Germany very hard because this is not in Germany's economic interest at all. So yes, the U.S. is, I think, creating big problems for itself, for other regions of the world, and for global security. But this approach to U.S. foreign policy is quite deeply entrenched, and it feeds the American arrogance, and it is backed by a lot of money and by the mainstream media. So the alternative point of view is literally being censored now. This point of view is not only not heard in the mainstream media, it's actually blocked in the mainstream media in certain ways, people's websites removed, or being declared that this is false information and removed from social media and so forth. It's rather extraordinary, especially for me. I appear on Western television every week normally, but now I'm pretty much blocked from the Western mainstream media because they don't want to hear even a debate on these subjects right now, and that is rather worrisome. Of course, most of the world does not believe this approach at all, and I think you make that point, and that's where I have the most hope, actually, which is most of the world knows the story, that this is not an unprovoked attack in 2022. This is a war that is between the U.S. and Russia that built up over 3 decades, and that both sides need to back off, and that this is a superpower conflict that needs to be ended because it's so dangerous for the whole world. And I'm hoping that that kind of diplomacy, where most of the world is very clear, don't do this, finally presses the United States and Europe back to reality, because the US and Europe thought the whole world will side with us in this. Everybody will oppose Russia, and it never happened. Quite the opposite. And that is a sobering fact, certainly in the U.S. context. But for all the reasons we said, it's not enough to end the war by itself. So I don't have the ultimate answer to your question, how to make the breakthrough, except continued education of the public and the discrepancy of the reality on the ground, which is completely tragic, and the promises that were made about defeating Russia and so forth. That gap might open more and more eyes, and it seems to be shifting opinion. It's interesting, by the way, there isn't a single leader in the NATO countries of Europe, a single pro-war leader that has more approval than disapproval rating. So the European politicians are quite unpopular. This war is quite unpopular. And maybe that will translate into a different political outcome sooner than we might imagine.
Yang, is it Mr. Yang? Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, my name is C. Yang, and I grew up from Taiwan, and currently is a U.S. citizen and had worked in the U.S. And first, I want to thank Professor Sachs for this very illuminating analysis. And these, I have been following your talks, and basically is worrying about my the previous homelands, Taiwan's security. And I completely agree with you that the weapon is not an approach to peace. And I want to preface my question to you with two things. One is my recent reading of a book. Another is in reference to one of the previous questioners' statement about the flip of the Ukrainian public opinion against the Russia after the war started. And I'm I don't know if you have noticed a book by Albrecht Colby, and the book's title is A Strategy of Denial. And I have read it, and it has 10 chapters, 11 chapters, I guess. It's and when I read, well, the first 9 chapters, it analyzes various, of course, he assumes that China is definitely going to somehow, sometime, well, the assumption is that how to refute China's growth, and get to various strategy. And I think the best strategy is to drag China into a U.S. Proxy war, is make Taiwan as Ukraine number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I get to chapter 10, I really alarmed with what he said is that well, the best after he spent 9 chapters discussing various strategy, and he has some doubt of its success. And he said that the best one is really to not to stop the Chinese Navy at the sea, and to let it land, let the Marine land in Taiwan. I don't know if you aware of that book. And he said that and then what happens, the street fight,
Oh God,
is going to produce sufficient image to make the surrounding countries, the Asian countries. He before in the chapter he said that the other countries may felt that China take over Taiwan peacefully or with some military. It's not going to be it's their internal matter, okay? But that won't work for the U.S. And what they need is to not to stop China from on the sea, and let them land. And
I understand.
The image of this fight is going to completely change all the opinion all over the world. Okay, and at that time, then the United States succeeded in dragging China down. Okay, so then he asked the question. Well, of course, I think this resonates with the previous questioner's statement. I don't know whether the number of 20% against Russia now changed to 80%. And I think if that indeed happens, that change in Taiwan is going to change. All over the world is going to change, and that's the human nature. And but these gentlemen, who is Trump's assistant secretary of state of a defense, and he said that well, the question is. He also analyzed. He said that China is not of course, China knows that will be disaster, and China is not going to fall into that trap. And the question remains is how do we make it happen? And okay, now my question is how. Of course, I would view that. I don't know if Russia in that case the invasion is inevitable, or is that a mistake from Russia? And that's one question that in your point of view. And second question is that if
can you be brief, because we have two more people wanting to ask questions.
Just the question is that how does the Taiwan and the China to get to the point where that it does not make it inevitable that China has to come to land at Taiwan.
Yes.
Of course, that's going to be a tragedy, and I do not want to see that happen. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Very interesting. One question is, did the U.S. deliberately provoke Russia to invade in this way that you're suggesting, that it would lead to this strong boomerang effect? It's not impossible that this was a strategy, but let me point out, or a tactic, but it clearly did not save Ukraine. And this vision that the public opinion would be so much against China that it would save Taiwan, I think is not a very realistic view. God forbid a war comes. Public opinion is not going to be the determining factor once the war comes. The idea is to prevent a war, not to trap China into some kind of military action. Now, in terms of my own view about this whole issue and the cross straits issue as well, and the U.S. relations with China, just to say a word, the U.S. actively aims to keep China from economic success right now. This is quite obvious. It's not only about limiting China's access to a few technologies for military purposes. It is to really hinder China's economic development. And the reason is clear, that the United States regards China as a direct competitor and a threat, and the U.S. foreign policy is designed to prevent the rise of any competitor nation. So the U.S. is trying to stop China's economic development. Now, my own view is, of course, this is a tragically wrong-headed approach. China's economic rise is not to the harm of the United States. It is to the benefit of the Chinese people. And so I favor China's economic development. In fact, I would go further. What has happened economically is that the US British-led world, which began in 1800 with the Industrial Revolution, has ended with the rise of East Asia, especially the rise of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the mainland, and the increasing development of large parts of ASEAN as well. And this is a wonderful thing, in my opinion, because it means the end of a imbalanced world in which only the Western countries were prosperous and everybody else was poor. If the countries of East Asia would not be divided by Cold War considerations, but rather the mainland and Taiwan and Korea and Japan would all cooperate and say, you know, we are the new center of the world economy. We produce all of the microchips. We produce all of so many advanced technologies. Why are we letting the US and UK divide us? We're really the very strong part of the world economy. We should be united. This would be, in my opinion, the absolute correct position to take. It would be the end of the Western-led world, not the end of the West, because the US would do just fine. But it would be the end of the idea that the United States runs the world. And that I want to see happen, because I don't want the US to run the world, or even, the US can't run the world, but I don't even want the US to have the illusion that it can run the world. I want the US to be nice to other places and to support their economic development and economic progress, and to stop trying to hinder other regions or divide other regions. So another vision of this is that really the key to solution lies within East Asia itself. It lies right across the straits, with the two sides saying, you know, we are so strong together. What are we fighting over? As long as we have a kind of decent political settlement, we don't need the armaments or the United States or anyone else to tell us what to do. Actually, this is the key for Taiwan's prosperity, in my opinion, as well as the mainland, which would thrive because of Taiwan's economic success. But I want to extend that to Japan and Korea as well, because what a powerhouse Northeast Asia is. It's the most powerful unit in the world economically. And that's good. That would provide a lot of the technology and production for a green economy, for solving the climate crisis, for becoming the digital age, which is led by Taiwan, and together with Korea and Japan. Just among the three, you produce almost all the chips that the world needs. So why is the US dictating what to do? This is something where Asia could say, stop bothering us. You know, we want to be friends, but stop dividing us. So that's the approach I would take, which is to recognize that we've come to the end of a 200-year period in history where the North Atlantic region led things, and say now it's a more balanced world. And our region of the world is actually at the cutting edge of the 21st century technologies, and we want to stay that way without war or without being divided across the straits or the Korean Peninsula or the Japanese islands. And I think that's feasible, but that requires the Asian leadership to stand up and say, you know, we don't want to be divided anymore. And we don't need the West to tell us about our own security. This is something we can work out internally. And I think that would be much, much safer for Asia.
Professor Fu Dawei, Professor Fu. Go ahead, Professor Fu. Have you unmuted?
Yes, you're still on mute, I think.
We can't hear you.
Sorry.
There you are.
Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous, so I keep on pushing the wrong button. Okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for Professor Sachs, the excellent talks, and I think even better in answering some of the difficult questions as we heard. Okay, I basically have two questions. The first is that about East Asia. I admire. I think your great vision. Okay, and your proposal that East Asian leaders can do this and that and things like that. But on the other hand, we all know that the United States or the government or the administration, they won't like this would happen, right? As you can see that the United States has recently strengthened their ties with Japan and South Korea and all that, and they won't let happen that Taiwan, because doing things similar things, and United States would always constantly, seduce or provoke seduce or try to connect the Taiwan's current government, DPP government, in order to make Taiwan as part of the United States back support, so that we call the first island chains in the Western Pacific. Still, I think United States would keep that way. So, or prevent some other political leaders in the East Asian would do different things. So I think this will be a big problem for us. Okay. And the second question I'd like to ask is that it's about the Europe. Okay. I think some earlier questions about you is about the Finland or Sweden, or they're changing their position from neutrality to trying to join the NATO. Okay, and I quite agree with you that many people or in the world they see, oh, the Ukraine war basically is the old game between United States and Russia. But how come that some periphery countries in Europe, and even including some formerly neutral countries in Europe, I heard that Switzerland, they are trying to switch their position from neutrality to join into the NATO. I don't know about Austria. You mentioned about Austria, permanent neutrality. I don't know whether they like to change their position as well. So that even if this is an old game and a lot of people in the world they can see through it, but what about Europe themselves? Their periphery countries, they quietly stable in the past, but why they like to change their position? Even some formerly neutral countries. So I like to know your opinion or your thinking about these matters. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, this is these are two wonderful questions. Let me start with the first one. What could Asia do? And of course, the story goes back to the first industrialization in the 19th century, when the European imperial powers showed up in East Asia, starting with the first Opium War, and then the Second Opium War, and so on. China and Japan were the first to face the Western imperial powers. And of course, Japan had the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and China was slower to react. But by the 1880s, China was already also undertaking substantive reforms. But it was ironic and sad. The Chinese diplomacy said to Japan, yes, we must fight the Westerners. And the Japanese diplomacy said, no, no, you're going to have to fight us. And Japan launched the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95 because Japan said, we're now part of the industrial club. And now you give us Formosa and and we'll start to control Korea as well. So Japan, of course, became the imperial power of Asia. And then in World War II, in the Pacific War, Japan had the idea of the Asian co-prosperity sphere, but under Japanese tutelage and imperial power. And of course, it was a disaster, and Japan was defeated at the end of the war, and the communists won the civil war in China and created the PRC. And the legacy of all of this is, of course, that Northeast Asia is deeply divided, and the model of a common Asian prosperity zone doesn't exist exactly because there's a fundamental historical division. I find it ironic, frankly, that Japan is the one that is saying, you know, we're afraid of China without acknowledging Japan's history of the last 100 years, where Japan actually was, of course, the belligerent power for most of the period, and should say, you know, we're so sorry for this imperial period we went through. We don't know what we were thinking, but we became intoxicated with our own industrial might and misbehaved, and we should actually go back to a common Asian vision, but without dominance by one party or another. Now, whether this is a workable kind of arrangement is a big question, because I think it is the 21st century question for Asia. China is so big that it's naturally frightening because the mainland is 1.4 billion people, and its success means that it absolutely looms larger than all the rest of the neighborhood. So will it play nice? Would it join in a truly Asian balanced sphere without the U.S. Meddling? Now, what could the U.S. do if the answer was yes, if Chinese diplomacy was really top-notch and promoting a truly Asian vision, not based on hegemony, but based on mutual and common security? I don't think the U.S. would have too many options, actually. I don't think the U.S. could stop that. It is the U.S. doctrine, just learn from Britain, which is never allow a dominant power in a continent of interest. So don't allow Germany to dominate or Russia to dominate in Europe, and don't allow China to dominate in Asia. And so we'll try to prevent that kind of rapprochement. But if China's diplomacy is smart, if it is smart, and of course it would have to be peaceful to be smart. I don't think the U.S. could stop that, actually. It will use fear, it will use enticements, but even this recent development of bringing the Japanese and the Koreans together against their common enemy doesn't really work for the United States. It's actually a piece of the puzzle in the other way, in my opinion, because it helps to overcome the Japan-Korea issues, which are very real, because the legacy of the colonial period remains a division. And now the U.S. is helping to overcome those divisions because it thinks that this will be good in the U.S.-led alliance against China. But I think what it will do is make it easier for China, Korea, and Japan to all agree to lower the tensions and make good relations within Northeast Asia. So I don't think the U.S. knows what it's doing, even in its in its very aggressive imperial vision or hegemonic vision. I think it's actually helping step by step to form a truly Asian approach, which I very much favor, as you can hear, because my first rule of economics is be nice to your neighbors, because you need them and they need you. And don't be hostile to your neighbors, whereas the first rule of empire is divide and conquer. So I'm really hoping that I'm right, that by bringing together Japan and Korea, actually the U.S. is helping to bring together China, Japan, and Korea, even though it doesn't recognize that that's what it's doing. Now, when it comes to Europe, I don't have an answer to your question exactly, except to make the following observations. First, specifically on Austria, there is a strong public opinion to maintain neutrality. So I don't see that changing. When it comes to Sweden and Finland, the U.S. push for NATO to come to those countries has been going on for 20 years. This is not just because of the war. In fact, both militaries have increasingly aligned with NATO, even without the membership. So this is not a sudden reversion. When it comes to Switzerland, if they do that, which they might, it would be very destructive of Swiss security, because actually Switzerland's prosperity depends on their neutrality even more than Sweden and Finland, because Swiss prosperity depends on people feeling safe to put your money in Switzerland. And if Switzerland joins the Western Bloc, much of the world will not put their money in Switzerland anymore, because the United States is a threat to the financial assets of any country that disagrees with it, which is why the de-dollarization is going to take place. So if Switzerland actually were to break neutrality, it would also break their banking system. And they should be thinking very, very carefully about this. You know, when it comes to Finland and Sweden, I think they've just made a terrible mistake, but it was one that was in the works for a long time, actually.
Thank you. Thank you, Branch.
Dr. Sachs, would you take 2 more questions, because we have 2 more people?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
and then
so,
probably at the top of the hour we should break, because it's been a long day too for me. Almost midnight.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Can I let Wei Chu Ko speak first, because Joanne, you'll be speaking for the second time. So Wei Chu Ko, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sachs. I surely hope that your prediction on the Northeast Asian power will become a reality, but that would depend on having wise and brave leadership who are able to speak against the U.S. policies or leaders. As we all understand that there are 2 important upcoming presidential elections. One is Taiwan, beginning of 2000 next year, and also the United States. I am going to pick your brain to prophesize the result and see what your personal observations and predictions on the election outcome. Would they change, make any change of the current political situations among Taiwan and China, and also between China and the US? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let me just say on the US side, we're obviously in a very unpredictable environment for a number of reasons. First, even the two leading candidates, Biden and Trump, are exactly equal in the polls right now. The public dislikes both of them to the same extent. Both have disapproval ratings significantly higher than approval ratings, and both score just about equally on the opinion surveys. Trump is under multiple indictments, so he faces huge legal issues. Biden could be impeached. It's not impossible. He would not be removed from office, but he could be impeached by the House of Representatives because it's quite possible that he committed bribery and other offenses in his dealings with his son's businesses, which are very odd, I have to tell you, because the son, who is not a healthy person or stable person, made $20 million from foreign governments, and Biden was not, the vice president was not smart enough to stay away from his son's business, but intervened repeatedly to meet the business associates and even called for the dismissal of the prosecutor in Ukraine that was investigating the son's business. So there's a lot of unpleasant facts. Put that together with the fact that Biden is old and obviously not in good shape. We don't even know whether he'll really be the candidate of November 2024, frankly. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and the United States is quite unstable in its general politics right now. The public is, of course, heavily polarized. The lack of trust in the media and in the political class is very high, and the situation is therefore very volatile. So if you ask me to predict, the prediction is lots of rough waters and surprises between now and November 2024. And that means that we're definitely in dangerous times also because of all of these unpredictabilities and politicians that take irresponsible actions because of narrow short-term political crises. So I'm not very happy with the situation right now at all in terms of what the political outcomes could mean. As to your election, I'm going to leave that to all of you. Maybe at another time you could explain to me, but I won't comment on the Taiwanese election.
Okay, thank you.
Joanne, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the second chance. Because Professor Sachs, you have mentioned about Taiwan purchase of arms. I would like to share with you, we are not engaging arm race with China. We just want to have our minimum amount of deterrence.
Yep.
Without arms, we will not be able to negotiate with China because we'll be so weak. Weakness is provocative. So we try to do our best to maintain the balance of Taiwan Strait. And also about one country, two systems you mentioned. I just like to share with you, 80% of Taiwanese population does not support one country, two systems, proposed by China in 1984. And then the hope was broken the past several years in Hong Kong and Macau. And the second point I like to raise is that personally, I think Putin has his personal ambition. He would like to be Peter the Great. But nevertheless, looking back what happened during the past year and a half, we can see it was a miscalculation made by Putin. That's why the war lasts so long. And just blaming the US will not help solve the issue. If you have chance to talk to Russia decision maker, tell them the casualty for the time being is 350,000 young men and women. It's not worthwhile. Whatever Putin's personal ambition, please put aside and face the reality. It was Russia who attacked Ukraine, and it will be Russia who pick up the pieces. And the Ukraine people, once upon a time, also brother and sister of Soviet Union. It's time not to blame anyone, but to sit down quietly and look at the situation and solve a peaceful solution. And the last point I'd like to make, Biden administration, I particularly remember Secretary of State Blinken. He made a speech in March 2021. He said, President Biden has promised diplomacy will always come first. And he said, the day after a major military intervention is always harder than we imagine, and how critical it is to pursue every possible avenue to a diplomatic solution. And I hope it will be applicable to Russia-Ukraine war, and also diplomacy will be priority of cross-strait relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just make a couple of responses. I absolutely do not share the view that is expressed widely that this is a matter of Putin's personal ambition. I've tried to explain what I think this war is about. The trope that he thinks he's Peter the Great and is trying to relive that is to my mind, with all respect, is a talking point of the U.S. government, not a serious point. And I see zero relevance of it. This is really a major state action for reasons that one can agree with or not agree with, but that have a lot of reasons and a lot of politics beyond them. Russia is not ruled by one person, no matter what the Western rhetoric might be. And by the way, mainland China is not ruled by one person either, despite the fact that that is the simple story that we are told in the United States. Even President Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator and so forth. This kind of talk is American talking points, not analytical seriousness. And I think it actually, of course, diminishes the possibility of solutions. Blinken did say diplomacy should always come first, but he's a very weak Secretary of State in my mind, and they did not follow that. And I can tell you specifically, on December 17th, 2021, when President Putin put on the table a proposal, a specific proposal that everybody can find online, a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. I called the White House at that point to speak to a very senior official and said, negotiate. This is the time for diplomacy. You don't agree with everything in that document, but that's what diplomacy is. They put things that are not acceptable, but there are things that are absolutely right in that document also. And they reflect the fact that Russia has real security concerns that need to be discussed right now. But they refused diplomacy. That's the sad truth. They refused diplomacy. They formally said to Russia, NATO enlargement is none of your business. We have an open door policy that means that the business is only between the candidate country and the NATO countries. It has nothing to do with you, and we don't discuss that with you. To my mind, that is the opposite of diplomacy, unfortunately. And this is sadly, I believe, how we got there. As regards, the public attitudes in Taiwan, of course, I wouldn't presume to get into that, except I would just say, be careful. Please be careful. You're dealing with an extremely sensitive and dangerous area, as you know better than anybody, and this requires a lot of prudence and a lot of discussion. And the United States is neither prudent nor diplomatic. And so these are issues where you cannot rely on the United States for your security, where you have to, of course, use your wits and your judgment and your discussion and diplomacy. I do not believe that weapons are a key issue in this personally, because I do not believe that this is about a military confrontation between the mainland and Taiwan, and that weapons are going to tilt the balance. My experience is the so-called security dilemma, which is if the United States does what it claims to want, or at least what certain senior people say, to make Taiwan a porcupine with the quills that are so big that it can't be touched from outside, that very process will put Taiwan in the greatest possible peril as the arms buildup approaches. And that's essentially what happened in Ukraine as well. If the United States says, and Taiwan's government says, we will arm to the teeth because that will be our security, I am sorry to say, I think that that would be a road to insecurity, not to security. I would worry about it tremendously, because I think the road to security is diplomacy and discussion, not even deterrence in this case, because you're talking about a vast power on the other side of the straits, and you're talking about the risk of being caught between two nuclear superpowers, and I would not wish that on anybody, and especially not on the wonderful, beautiful, lovely, and prosperous place of Taiwan. So I would just urge prudence, caution, and diplomacy.
Dr. Sachs, thank you so much for this excellent talk, and especially at this late hour. It's past midnight in New York. You have left us with very heavy feelings, but maybe that's a good thing. I think today's talk will reverberate in our conversations for a long time to come, and we will, of course, add a Chinese subtitle to this video and put it online to share with others. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for the great honor to be with you today, because I really greatly appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon also. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much, Dr. Sachs.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.